Welcome to the Retail Tech Podcast, where we talk about the full spectrum of technologies and implementation used in omni-channel and online retail. Make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at retailtechpodcast.com, and we always look forward to your feedback. Today I'm talking with Richard Lee, CEO of Datawire, a company out of Cambridge, Massachusetts that's focusing on providing tools for microservices. Hi, Richard.
Hi, Darius.
Thank you for taking the time to talk to me. Please give me an overview of what is Datawire and maybe what are microservices.
Yeah, so microservices, I'll start with microservices. It's an architecture that's really gotten a lot of mindshare and popularity over the past few years because companies like Netflix and Uber and Yelp have really pioneered this as a way to accelerate the rate of innovation. Because what these companies have realized is that if the consumers that are using their products are very fickle and they never actually know exactly how they want to use their product, and so they want to fundamentally improve how quickly they can respond to the market and improve their business agility. And the way they do this is instead of creating one big monolithic application, they break that monolithic application out into smaller microservices. And the key thing is with each of these microservices, you have your own development team working on that microservice, and that team is empowered to ship that feature whenever it's done. And so instead of your traditional model where you have one feature that waits for everyone else's features, it gets integration tested and shipped to the market and made available, you actually have lots of teams that are able to independently iterate and test each of those features. And so we've seen this tremendously successful. Netflix, Airbnb, all these companies have basically adopted this model so they can quickly iterate and see what do their customers actually want. And if something actually works well, they invest more in it and they can quickly respond. And if something doesn't work as well, they can actually adjust and pivot. So that's really what microservices is.
Okay. And then what does Datawire do?
So the challenge with microservices, we've spent probably the past 18 months working with a number of different companies, and we found that you really have to build a lot of infrastructure in order to realize these benefits because it's a different kind of development model. And we realized, though, once you actually build this infrastructure, there's a lot of benefits. And so it really doesn't need to be that hard. And so what we've done is we've actually built a set of tools and technologies so that any company can actually start writing microservices in just a couple minutes. So you don't actually have to. Netflix actually started with 30 engineers building out all this infrastructure, and now we have a cloud-based service, and you create an account, and 5 minutes later, you're actually running microservices.
Okay, so by infrastructure, you mean software like hosting, space, DevOps processes, things like that, or is it also like an organizational aspect to it?
Really, it's about having the software tools. So your developers themselves are coding microservices, and so in order to code microservices, they need special APIs above and beyond the APIs they currently use. And so what we've done is we've actually built software that augments your existing web application framework, whether you're using Node.js or Ruby on Rails or Flask on Python, and you're able to basically have an extra set of APIs that are expressly designed so that you can write microservices. So you take your existing web application, add a couple lines of code using our APIs, and you've turned it into a microservice.
Okay. I think this is the key part for me that you mentioned was accelerating the rate of innovation. It's really key to understand what that really means because, as developers think about tools, they think, okay, how is this going to specifically focus on, my work in generating more code? But microservices goes beyond just the development and code generation. It's an organizational emphasis on innovation and rapid innovation and testing, right?
That's exactly right. I think one of the key things is that if you look at how engineering organizations in the past have operated and been measured, it's been with how many features can you actually produce, right? And so if you use Scrum and Agile development methodologies, you may be familiar with story points. And I've been part of many meetings where the engineering VP says we do 50 story points a week, and then everyone says, well, how do we get to 60? And the engineering manager said, well, we'll hire 5 more engineers and we get to 60. And in a microservices world, and I think really the modern world today, that notion of measuring velocity in terms of features or lines of code produced doesn't make a lot of sense. I think what makes sense is how quickly you can actually respond to the market. So if someone gives you a piece of feedback and says, you know what, this is how we want to buy, then how quickly does it take for you to actually iterate and implement that feature and get it out to the door so that it can actually be tested in the market? Because that iteration speed is actually what produces true innovation. And you could be producing lots of lines of code, but they could be doing the wrong thing. And you never know if you're doing the right thing until some customer is saying, I'm paying money and using it the way I want it to be done. And so by using microservices, you can vastly improve your iteration speed.
Right, right. By building the wrong thing, you mean a feature that technically may work fine, but it may not be what the customer wants. And this
Exactly.
is
And
what
I've
you're,
never
yeah.
seen, and I'm sure, Darius, you've seen this too. I've never seen a feature that when you specify it on a piece of paper and then you deliver it to a customer, the customer says, that's exactly what I wanted, right?
Yeah, yeah, I know. So this is interesting. So, like, microservices architecture stands like, goes with the acronym of MSA. I'm thinking from what you mentioned, you can take MSA and also call it modern services architecture or modern software architecture. It's really, and there is nothing bad or nothing judgmental about the previous architectures. It's just that this is an evolution, and it just makes sense to me. In my own company as well, I'm trying to see how we can do it with a much smaller team, but it just makes sense to do this because ultimately, if the customer doesn't like what you are building, you're not going to succeed.
I think that's exactly right. I think if you look at how cloud applications are built today, they are still built using the same design principles as 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, Amazon didn't really exist, the cloud wasn't really there, and and DevOps was not a term, right? And all of these innovations have really changed how we build and consume software. Yet we still build cloud applications the same way we did 20 years ago. And I think that over the next 20 years, everyone who's building cloud applications will shift to microservices. And so I agree with you, Darius. If maybe a better term is a modern services architecture.
So now I've heard some people refer to really microservices being an evolution of SOA. What are your thoughts about that?
So I think the reason why people say that is that there are a lot of technical similarities. I think you basically have services that communicate with each other and you try to create some separation between those services. To me, the biggest difference between SOA and microservices is that microservices is really a decentralized architecture. With SOA, you typically had a central service bus and everything plugged into that service bus, and all your intelligence is in that service bus in a central point. There is no bus in a microservices architecture. And more importantly, not only is there no bus, it's really an incremental approach to adopting microservices. So you start typically by writing one microservice, and then two microservices, and then three, and you never deploy a bus. Well, if you think about adopting SOA, you actually start by saying, let's get everyone in a room. We're going to make this big architectural decision. We're going to buy this very expensive bus, and then we're going to deploy that. And then everyone's going to rewrite to talk to the bus. And it's a big decision. And with microservices, it's really a little decision and you evolve, right? And I think, Darius, that's exactly the
Mhm.
term you used. I think you evolve into microservices. You don't go from no microservices to 500 microservices overnight.
Okay, so as we know, it's really that evolution takes time and it takes actually a lot of work for a company that already is operating with a monolith. For them to start adding on microservices, how do they do that? Don't they need some kind of, I'm going to just use this word bus, but I mean, they need some kind of a communication layer with the, or how is that actually done when you
So
start? Yeah.
So they just use so the beauty of microservices and the reason why it's so popular is they can use their existing technologies to create something. So if you have a monolith, what I would do is I would just say pick a feature and I would write that feature as a separate web application using and then I would use something like Datawire to actually connect that application to the monolith so that they can actually talk to each other. But the beauty of this is you're using your exact same technologies. Your developers aren't learning anything that's really new, and they're using, for example, just HTTP and JSON to actually communicate between the monolith and microservices. It works just fine if you have the right other technologies in place. And and it turns out there's not that many of them. You just need to have them, right? And it's just it's technology that's been not super accessible, but we and a number of other companies are working to try to change that.
Okay. So I think that's, and also talking to a couple of other people that actually are using microservices, this is so important for companies like Datawire and other companies to start building these tools so that this concept will actually start to become a solid, practice within organizations. So I'm glad to see you guys are doing this.
Yeah, I think it's exactly right. I think up to now there's really been a perception, and I think it's a mostly accurate one, which is there's a lot of stuff you need for microservices. And what we've done is we've done a lot of work in trying to figure out what's the minimum set of things you need for microservices, and that's what we've worked on trying to make really easy. There's a lot of things you can use, but the hard part is what are the first three things you need for microservices? And that's that. And it turns out there's just so much information out there; it's hard to figure that out. But I think over the next few years, you're going to see that it's just really easy to actually write microservices as the tooling really starts to get out there.
Right. So I attended the Microservices Practitioner Summit that the Datawire organizes last week, which was very good. I'm doing a write-up on that, talking to a couple of the customers that actually attended that. This was the second one, right? The first one was in January. Is that correct?
Yeah, so in January, we had a Microservices Practitioner Summit really featuring some of the folks who are really advanced. So we had Uber, we had Yelp, we had Netflix, we had New Relic, a bunch of these companies. And what we wanted to do for our July summit was to find companies that were not quite as sophisticated, but were very much deploying microservices because we felt like their stories in some ways are more relevant than what Uber does. What Uber does is fascinating and really interesting, but the reality is that Uber went from 850 engineers to 1,700 engineers in 6 months, right?
Wow.
And not that many organizations I can think of literally try to double from 850 to almost 2,000 engineers in 6 months. And so they have a problem that no one else has, which is how do you make 850 new engineers productive right away? Um,
Right.
so that's why I was excited to have Zalando, a retailer from Germany, and Not on the High Street from the UK. Both of them are retailers. Actually, talk about what they're doing with microservices because I think it's just it's a little closer to where I think most of the market is, which is we're not Uber, but we're very interested in microservices.
Right. Which is also hits close for me because we're also building a retail uh, commerce platform, and we're not big. Hopefully, we will be, but I want to minimize any rework we have to do in the future by at least planning and putting things in place right now that can help us, become a microservices organization in the future. So that's why I'm trying to educate myself as well, and definitely will look into, you know, uh, Datawire and getting the tool implemented as soon as my engineers can catch up with the workload.
Right.
So um, now another thing that you also mentioned is using JSON and REST, and I also heard people talking about RPC. What is the difference, and what are the benefits of each one, in your view?
Yeah, so RPC is, I think, a general umbrella term, and REST and JSON, along with HTTP, is one form of RPC. And the advantage of REST and JSON is that everyone knows how to use it. It's ubiquitous. It turns out, as you actually start to scale your system, you start running into resilience problems if you just use straight REST and JSON. And the best analogy I can come up with is it's like Christmas tree lights. REST and JSON are like Christmas tree lights where if one light bulb goes out, your entire strand goes out. And what you really want to do is you want to do a more sophisticated RPC, an asynchronous RPC, where if one light bulb goes out, all your other light bulbs still can operate. And and so what we've seen is that companies, as they mature along their adoption curve with microservices, they go from HTTP, REST, and JSON to something more sophisticated like a gRPC or a Thrift, or sometimes you can actually add additional layering on top of HTTP. So, Datawire, we actually add circuit breakers, which is a way to actually protect the rest of your services from a single failure transparently, and that lets you actually go much, much further with just HTTP and JSON than you would otherwise. So there's a lot of different trade-offs. My general recommendation is stick with the technology you actually understand until there's a clear reason to actually move. There's no reason to actually adopt technology just because that's what the big guys do, because there are hidden costs there, right?
Right, right. And you never know if you're going to get to that point. So
Exactly.
additional investment in the beginning might actually delay that process. So
Right.
talking about the Zalando and not on the high street, how are they actually using? Are they actually using Datawire?
No, they've invested. They started adopting microservices while we were still in development, and actually, honestly, in Zalando's case, quite a bit before. We just think that their stories are very relevant, and the design choices and the architectural choices. They're not using our technology, but they're using the same architectural principles that we've actually implemented. The difference is, of course, the Zalando technology stack is not open source, so if you're interested in it, you can't get it. Same with not on the high street, and so you really need to implement all the things that they actually implemented, one way or the other.
Okay, so they've basically built in the functionalities and the infrastructure that you are providing as a service to
Correct.
companies.
Yeah, and we provide it as both. We have an open source component, which is an SDK that developers can use, as well as a cloud service that adds additional value. So we have two different components to the technology we provide.
Okay. One question as far as like, when you talk about a large company that's trying to make a decision, who typically would make a decision to use microservices and eventually maybe like tools like Datawire in that organization? Is it the CIO or the CTO or
We found it really varies. So sometimes we talk to the CTO or the VP of engineering, and it's a little bit more of a top-down decision. Sometimes it's a developer who actually starts by writing a microservice just as an experiment and shares it. What I would say is it's really an organic adoption process. It's very consensus driven, where different people say, okay, I think it's worth trying it out, and different people then eventually converge on a solution. The reality is that you will not be successful if your VP of engineering believes in your solution and your developers don't, or vice versa. And so we found that the person who starts that conversation really varies, but in the end, you're really trying to get everyone aligned around the concept, because it's really around, as we talked about, how you actually organize, how you choose to do software development, the metrics that you use. And so this all touches developers in some areas. The metrics is clearly more of a management function. So you really want to try to drive alignment over time with the entire organization.
right? Ultimately, the management really has to be behind this for it to work because it requires change.
Right. And what we found is that that's actually the easy part. It's really getting the developers on board, is sort of some more challenging things. We're seeing so many conversations, so many different companies about microservices at even a board level. Because board members are hearing their different companies are all adopting microservices, and they're asking their companies, what are you doing about microservices? Because if we don't adopt microservices, we're concerned that our competitors will, and they will out innovate us.
Right. So on a technical uh, aspect, if somebody wanted to start using Datawire, it's pretty quick to start using it. You mentioned like just adding a couple of lines of code. Is there any training? What kind of training is involved?
So what we've done is if you actually go to the Datawire website, you can actually create a free account in our cloud service, and there's a wizard that actually does a little tutorial of our API. It's 5 steps. It tells you how you install things. It gives you the key API calls you need. You pick your language that you use. So it has tutorials in 4 different programming languages, and then off you go. So we've tested this. We've had a number of folks who actually have used this successfully, and so that's all you really need to do.
Okay, great. One of the other things that came out in the summit last week was the question of uh, having the teams that are building these different microservices being independent in even choosing, selecting what software languages they want to use. So there was a question as to how do you ensure if you have people using 10 different pieces of software in your organization and one of them leaves, how do how do you support that if somebody just, they have that level of independence? So in your experience, how do companies manage that,
So it
organization
varies.
aspect?
It's a great question. It really varies. Some companies they actually just universally dictate and say every single service is going to be written in this language, right? And there's a sort of an official set of languages. Other companies are much more lenient, and they basically let the organization or the developer teams actually choose specific technologies, and as long as they conform to common standards, because you do need some common standards around, for example, logging or discovery or how you actually deploy your software, because you don't want to have some people deploying on Amazon and some people deploying in Google and some people deploying on Microsoft. Um, but but if you create a common set of standards, and more importantly, you make it easy to adhere to those standards. So it's not just creating a document, but you're creating a process and training and documentation for those things. Um, Maybe sometimes some technology, then that's really how you actually drive standards. And I think so. It really, to answer your question, it really just varies. I think it just depends on the kind of culture and organization that you're trying to build.
Okay, so you could actually still have a microservices architecture, but use a specific tool set.
Yes.
Yes.
Yep. So HubSpot, which is a publicly traded company that provides marketing software, spoke at our first summit, and they're 100% Java, and they have thousands of microservices. Um, Netflix, on the other hand, they also have thousands of microservices, but they actually use multiple languages at this point, right? So they don't have 20 languages, but they actually are actively experimenting with 4 or 5. They're primarily Java and JavaScript, but they've been adding more languages as they could go along. So it really just depends on the organization and some of the trade-offs of having more languages versus less.
Okay. One more question I have is regarding the DevOps 2.0, as the term is evolving into right now. What is the connection between microservices architecture and DevOps?
So you need DevOps in order to really deploy microservices at scale. And the reason for this is if you write a microservice, you want it to be automatically deployed into production. And that's really a DevOps function. And imagine over time, you're going to want hundreds of microservices. And so even if you have one microservice, you might be able to manually deploy this into production. But when you start having hundreds of microservices with different development teams and engineers working on each of these, you're going to need automation. And that's where DevOps and a lot of the exciting new DevOps technologies like Docker or Mesos really come into play. And so I think DevOps and microservices really go hand in hand.
Okay, yeah, I think that's very important because we could be building a lot of things, but if you don't have an agile or I guess flexible um, deployment
Right.
infrastructure, it's going to be a bottleneck. So
Exactly.
great. So what about any other tools or any other things that are happening in the microservices world that are exciting you, interesting for you right now?
I mean, I think really some of the most exciting stuff is really around the stuff that Docker and Mesos and Kubernetes, those companies are doing. The other project I would mention that we actually use internally that we're big fans of is Netflix has open sourced a project called Spinnaker, which really automates how you go from your source code all the way into production. It's another deployment workflow management tool, and so we're big fans of all the innovations that's been happening around DevOps and microservices, and it's exciting to see because we're adopting a lot of that internally and seeing some of the benefits right away.
Right, and I think there is definitely a lot of some investment as well, starting to go into companies that are building tools for microservices. Like your company is has a venture investors, and other companies, the investors or VCs are actually looking into this area as well.
Yeah, I think it's because if you look at a lot of the more mature venture-backed companies, like Twitter or Facebook, um, you know, Airbnb, all these companies have raised lots of capital and they're all adopting microservices. So inevitably, the VCs are saying, okay, there's something to this, and so we're starting to see just lots of interest across the board in microservices, and certainly the investment dollars are also there as well.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. I think this was really the tip of iceberg as far as your knowledge and experience, but I think it's a good start, for people, especially like executives and people that have to make decisions on how to invest and what to plan, how to strategize for the future of their organization. They need to know some of these things so that they can make the right decisions. So I appreciate it, and hopefully we'll get to get more and more updates from Datawire. When's the next summit, by the way?
So we're probably planning a mini summit in later this year, and then we're going to have an in-person summit in January of 2017 in San Francisco. So,
Oh, okay, great. Fantastic. Great. Thank you so much, Richard. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Darius, pleasure's mine.
Have a good day. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode and would really appreciate rating us on Stitcher or iTunes. Also, make sure you subscribe to our newsletter at retailtechpodcast.com to be notified of new episodes, updates, and special announcements.